Welcome everyone. Today we are talking about institution-specific questions. I shared a document with all of our institution-specific questions, cutting out those ones asking about experiences, because those are so very different, but we're asking the same thing. We see this as a really useful time to talk and ask questions and learn from each other. If you have specific questions you wanted to ask about, or notice that other sites were asking something similar to you, wanted to talk about that, I encourage you to speak up, ask questions in the chat, raise your hand, whatever you're most comfortable with. But to start us off, we pulled together a short list of questions that we thought were interesting and stood out a little bit. Let's see. Do we have anyone from the Imagination Station here? I have so many names. Trying to scroll through. If we do have someone from the Imagination Station, we saw the question, which of the following topics, if any, would you like to see more of at the Imagination Station? And we're wondering how you used responses to this question. We may not have anyone from there yet. All right, I'm gonna go if we don't have anyone. I'm just trying to keep track of the list, but the list is very big. St. Louis Science Center, because I see Liz. I'm sorry, I've just butchered your name.
Elisa. Hi.
Elisa,
yes.
Sorry. I'm used to seeing it and not saying it. So we noticed that the St. Louis Science Center asks about how much money your group spends while they're at your institution, but not including memberships. How accurately do you feel that people are with that question?
Well, I will tell you, just from being on the floor doing the data collection, I see a number of people pulling out receipts to check their math for the day. So while there's certainly some room for error in there, it's there's a fair amount of people trying to get it accurate. And I'll just say, for us, one of the reasons we ask is, for those who don't know, we are free general admission. So it's good for us to get a sense of what portion of our audience say they are actually spending nothing on a visit, which is totally possible here, versus buying tickets for any one of the venues. We also have a paid parking lot. Just sort of getting that sense and of who's spending what kind of money, so that we can do some cross analysis on it. And this is a question we had on our exit survey long before COVES even existed, so we wanted to keep it going.
How have you found that particularly useful in any way?
I think it's been useful to be able to see what portion, like I said, aren't paying anything, because that has actually been something that has dropped in the last couple of years. And I think part of that is because we actually have two parking places, because we have two entrances to the facility, one by the main door, which is our paid parking lot, and one by a secondary door, which is free. However, during the pandemic, that secondary door and that associated parking lot have been closed off. And so I suspect that that's part of why we've been seeing fewer people reporting spending zero, because a larger portion of our audience is having to pay to park. So that it sort of helps us thinking about where people are spending money, and what the cost of a visit is, and then we can actually compare it against box office numbers. But because we get a little bit more, because it includes spending money in the gift shop or the food service or or like I said, parking, it's a little bit fuller picture than just box office. So we report a lot of per cap kind of stuff.
Thanks, that's really helpful to think about. For those who just joined, if you want to jump in with questions, either in the chat or raise your hand, please do so. Otherwise, I have some questions that I have. In the chat, Chris is asking, remember seeing that some institutions were asking if the museum comes across as new or old. Anyone use that question and have thoughts about how that's been useful?
It was mentioned by someone on a relatively recent COVES meeting, but I just can't remember who.
I had thought it was you all, Allison, but I am not seeing it in your list of questions. But and maybe it was an older one, but I felt like there was a moment where somebody was considering renovations and was trying to get that perception. And I would love to hear from whoever it was as well.
I don't think we've asked that on COVES, but that is something that we have asked during evaluations, or if we did, it's possible we've done it on an old version of COVES. I know that we've used that and similar questions to help pinpoint the areas that we want to do renovations or prioritizing galleries that we feel need to be updated. Gretchen saying that feels like SMM used to ask something, there was something new to do, but that may have also been pre-COVES.
We did have a question that's in the document Allison shared that we used for a while. We're not actually using it any longer, about whether people felt whether they were expecting current science at the Science Center, and to what extent they felt they found it. That was one we used for a little while just to sort of get a sense of what people's expectations were around the content. And it was somewhat intentionally vague in how people might interpret current science. And so what we found is the responses on the open-ended question related to that were generally just about science topics that we had in the museum, whether or not we might consider them current. Although some people did respond with very specific things that they wanted to know about, particularly things related to the pandemic and COVID and stuff like that. So it was useful for a little while just to see what content was resonating for folks. It wasn't the sort of question that was going to make sense for us to ask long term. So we did it for maybe about a year, and then said, okay, we've gotten what we can get out of it. And I don't think we really got out as much as we maybe hoped we would when we started asking the question. So I don't know if that's the one you're thinking of, Chris, or if it was somebody else's, but it was kind of sort of related.
I found the one, and it was one of the MOS ones that was asking about exhibits being up to date. And we ended up shifting that a little bit to ask, so MOS has had a big initiative to be more relevant, be more up to date, having exhibit and other evaluations point to people noticing the age. And we use that partially as a metric around our new exhibits to see if that's shifting, as we are pushing a lot more new exhibitions, really pushing some of that current science. But we're also have now started to add questions more tied to those specific exhibits for like 3 or 6 months, and asking about the specific topics we're covering. So we've had some focus on climate change exhibits and vaccine exhibits. So being much more specific with current and up to date to specific topics rather than the more general question we have also asked. But I think that's a great question and a good reminder that we have it on our survey. Lauren has a question. Has anyone gleaned valuable information about visitor use and value of interpretive materials such as wall text, gallery guides, audio tours?
At the Minneapolis Institute of Art, Lauren, we ask this questions about these elements specific to our special exhibitions. So they don't actually live on our COVES survey right now, but they're more closely aligned with, like, you are in that section. We're also a free museum, but that's a paid experience for the most part. So we have a sort of short optional survey at the end of that section to ask questions exactly like this. And we ask pretty consistent questions about our interpretive materials and experience inside of our exhibitions, because then we work really closely with our curatorial team and our exhibition planning team to sort of see, like, in this exhibition, we really focused on teaching people about how to make prints. Did they learn that process? Like, did all of these didactic strategies and interpretive strategies that we tried to implement in this space actually make a difference to that experience? Are people telling us that we accomplished that sort of exhibition educational related goal or interpretive goal? So that may not be helpful, because it right now it is really tied to just a portion of our museum experience rather than that general visit. But I'm always happy to share what those questions look like and if that's useful to anyone, for sure.
Related to that, I know a lot of institutions ask about audio tours or guided tours on their list of what did you see or do, or what did the motivation question about why did you decide to visit today, has that been used in a similar way to Lauren's question?
This is Alyssa. We asked this question in our, like, what did you do during your visit? And specifically have, like, labels and wall texts and our audio tour as well. And then we have something called a digital family guide, which is like that aspect that you were talking about, Lauren. But, you know, what I find interesting about this is that, you know, overwhelmingly people are saying that they read labels and wall text, and that's like the very, like, rises to the top, which in some ways is not surprising, but is also good to reinforce, you know, for staff here. So I can share some of that if you're interested, just how we ask that.
Are there any questions people have where they've been trying to figure out how they might want to ask questions, or like topics they're trying to tackle? I know that some institutions are a little bit more focused on DEAI initiatives. I was wondering if SMM could talk to about some of the questions that you've had around equity and how you've used that, or what you've found most useful about how you've been asking those questions.
I can get going and then Gretchen will chime in, I'm sure. So this is Marjorie Baquette. I'm Director of Evaluation and Research at Science Museum, Minnesota. So first of all, I will say we have DEAI things that we do with our data that aren't about asking visitors, that are just really regularly, some of you have heard me talk about this before, but really regularly and consistently trying to present our data in the context of our local setting, so people don't have to wonder, where is our audience like our local context? And we get some out of town visitors, but not as many as some of you all do. And so we line up our race and ethnicity numbers against Twin Cities and Minnesota race and ethnicity numbers. We do the same with income. We do the same with education. I can think of no more important tool for getting your staff really familiar with where do we match and where are we different than our local audiences if we were just getting a random sample of people off the street. And when we think about our museums and their missions and the ways that they want to reflect the community that we are surrounded by, it just takes repeated comparisons. More recently, we've been starting to add questions to try and understand how visitors feel are sort of attending to different experiences. So you can see in our section a huge chunk of questions that were about a cardboard exhibit, where we were setting visitors up to play with cardboard, and it was being designed with local BIPOC families, but being sort of presented as this is an experience for everyone. So we wanted to understand who was coming to cardboard and how they were staying, and how that maybe was different or similar for audiences from different backgrounds, including race and ethnicity, but also including feeling like STEM is something that they do. So are they a STEM professional family? And also, are they makers or crafters? So you can see a huge series of questions that we're doing for that. We've also been adding questions, and I can't look at your faces, and I'm on one screen today, but you can see some of the questions in there about perception of the museum. And so there are questions that we are asking, not do you feel the impact of the museum's work on equity yourselves, but what is your perception of the museum's commitment to working on equity, education, and science? And that is really for our understanding. We assume that we are seen as working towards science, maybe or maybe not in your particular community. But we try and, we get pretty good ratings on science, and we get pretty good ratings on education, and our equity numbers are a little lower depending on the experience that the person has had. So that is about understanding how people see us. And we ask, as Gretchen says in the comments, we actually ask that question in a lot of different settings. And then finally, there's a chunk of questions that we've added more recently about, as we've been talking more actively about equity or about climate change or all of these things, not just in like one exhibit element, but across social media and other places. We've been asking people, did you learn something new? Do you feel moved to take action? Those kinds of questions to try and understand what the impact may be. So we played with a lot of different kinds of questions. I will not say, other than comparing your audience to your local context, I don't feel like we've done anything that has world changed, that has really answered every question we have, but we keep playing with these questions because they are so key to our mission. And so I'm happy to go in a little bit deeper on any of those aspects, but I just wanted to highlight some of the things that we've tried on that front.
Thanks. I think that's really useful. Also in the comments, I think very related, there's a couple questions about Putnam's use of welcome and relevant, and how you've responded to those, if they were, when they are high or when they are low.
Hi, this is Betsy Matt Turner. We joined COVES about a year ago, and we have just gotten kind of the point where we have a sample that is something that we can, it's a large enough sample that we can think about whether things are generalizable. So I would say at this point, we've been trying, we're in a strange situation to develop a baseline because it was right in the middle of the pandemic when we started. So our intention going forward, and I have to say, as I said, we're just at the point where we're more generalizable, is a lot of our strategic plan and other work that we're doing, work that kind of started about 15 years ago, but which is really going to be coming to fruition more in the next couple of years. We have a capital campaign that's in a quiet phase. And for example, one of the projects we're working with Science Museum of Minnesota on redoing our regional history exhibit, which has a very definite Anglo-European bent to it. So working on making sure that that exhibit, as it's reimagined, reflects the diversity of our community and the contributions and stories of our community. So right now, I'd say we're still in the baseline period of that, and we're going to be particularly interested as we move forward with that exhibit, another area called the Innovators Gallery, and several others, to see if we are seeing changes across various demographic groups in terms of welcome and the extent to which they find it welcoming and relevant. Our samples are relatively small and on subgroups at this point, so it would be hard to tell. But that is our intent as we are moving forward, is to look at our people across the board, but also within specific populations, seeing the Putnam as relevant, as welcoming. Those are big areas of focus of our strategic plan, and some of the things that we're particularly trying to move forward with during our capital campaign. So I don't have a lot of data to date to talk about fluctuations up and down. Rachel, do you have anything you want to add on that?
Well, just that I don't know if you guys can hear me. Give me a thumbs up. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
I'm having some technical issues. Just that we have noticed a trend that in a previous lifetime, I was very involved with public schools, and that we find that among our racial ethnicity along those lines and poverty level, that we actually end up with somewhat more favorable responses in this area. And this was a trend that we found in our public schools as well. And this idea of, appreciation of being asked and completion of surveys and things like that. And I guess it's a discussion point for all of you if you're seeing kind of Hawthorne effect type results coming out of your work in COVES, are being so new to the partnership. If you find that you're seeing differences in response rates or in favorability rates among your different demographics.
Has anyone looked for that or analyzed those differences? I don't know that we've looked at that closely at MOS. I think that's something we kind of look at annually.
We're encouraged by it. I think it's a positive response for us. As Betsy said, the sample sizes are pretty small for us right now because we're so new to the partnership. But it's an area we're very focused on, especially as we continue to innovate at the museum to make sure that we're meeting the needs of those audiences.
Yeah, so I have kind of a tangential kind of related addition, but our organization's really focused on building in physical accessibility accommodations. So we pretty frequently kind of dive in and isolate those who indicate that someone in their party had a disability of some kind, and then compare that against kind of the generic non-disability audience. So we kind of do that comparison, and generally we do have a lot more favorable ratings, but we also get a lot more kind of in-depth discussion of ways that we can make improvements and adjustments as well. So when we fall flat, we fall really flat. And but overall the ratings are generally more positive. So that's a group with a very specific need, but it's, an isolated audience that we're really focused on and how they compare against other visitors. So hopefully that's helpful. It's not exactly what you're talking about, but
it is interesting. I mean, and that's just something we'll be continuing to look at as trend and to see if we can triangulate that data through gallery surveys and other sources.
And I was just looking back through the chat and I saw people had questions about a couple of our other questions. One being about people feeling safe, another being about people being able to find their way in the museum, and about learning about our collection. The safe question we put in there because of COVID. The one about finding their way around or learning about the collection, those are, again, right now, we're considering this a baseline period. The capital campaign I just mentioned is going to be doing some things to improve the flow of the museum. The museum was built as 3 different buildings at different times, and they didn't all line up in terms of floors, so you could come to dead ends or just what we call the lost zone. So as we make some of those capital changes, which are opening the buildings up to one another somewhat more, we're hoping that we'll see people saying, yes, I can get around. We're about 115,000 square foot facility, and especially if you have physical mobility issues, it can be challenging, especially if you can't find your way around. And then the question about learning about our collections also relates to that campaign. We have one of our major projects is going to be creating more displayable storage, and people being able to access as well virtually more of the collection to look at maybe things that are related to their cultural background or just some interest of theirs. So again, this is the baseline period where we're kind of saying, okay, how are people rating that right now in terms of our collection? Personally, before I worked at the museum, I had no idea that we had a collection. So we'll see how that goes as well.
Thank you. There's some conversation in the chat. I was wondering if Alyssa would be willing to talk a little bit about that with the words describing Nelson Atkins. I know that MOS had done something similar where we were looking for emotional responses or emotions after visiting. And I'm curious how Nelson Atkins how'd you use that list and what did you learn from that?
Yeah, and I think one of the questions here was, how did we come up with those words? And they're really based off of Slover Lynette's questions that they asked during our audience research study that we did with them. And we took those responses to that and used it to create this list. But we also wanted to throw in some, negative words in there. We didn't want to be completely positive. So we have like the welcoming, engaging, relevant, inclusive, accessible, but also included, like elitist and intimidating, stereotypical, irrelevant, overwhelming. And what we really found is that, the more positive words rise to the top. People are really rating those the highest. The more negative words only have, tens of responses maybe to them, which is great for us to know like where we're like heading in the right direction. Overwhelming is at 10%, which, is like 100 people-ish. So that's good to know that we also have some of the same issues that we were talking about a little earlier about wayfinding and how it can be a little bit confusing. And then we also asked an open-ended question sort of related to this. And a lot of those responses, I think similar to like the overwhelming are saying, that people are interested in more benches, they're getting lost, they may need more accommodations in our space, which is something that we need to think about. And then we also asked this like psychographic profile question. And what we're trying to do there is, Slover Lynette came up with these amazing psychographic profiles for us. And we have an idea of what the percentage of those profiles should be within our general audience. And so with this question, we're just trying to figure out if our audience rates themselves in the same way, if they're putting themselves into those buckets. And so far, it seems like they are.
think that's really helpful. Do you report on that in any specific ways?
So we're just doing baby steps into reporting out with this data. I don't have like a consistent way to do it. We have some meetings that we have with leadership where we talk about those responses and report out in that way. But I would love to hear how other people are using COVES data to report out, because we've only just started collecting data. I feel like it's really recently, but it's been since September, and I only just switched back to in person. So I'd love to hear how other people are using this.
I'm especially curious how, because I know we've talked a little bit about reporting out in some of those shared questions. I'm curious if there's any differences or things that stand out to you in how you report data back differently for some of your institution specific questions versus like more general demographics.
I can jump in. We've got a institution specific question. It's just one of those 0 to 10 rating scales about wayfinding. It was easy to find my way around. And that's one that we're really concerned about and focused on, just because we've heard a lot over time from our visitors that wayfinding is very difficult in our building. We also didn't used to offer a paper map. So that was kind of a big adjustment that we made, and we were able to watch that score go up, which was really cool. In our reporting, because that is such a kind of institutional focus for our full organization right now, we have a specific, I do a monthly slide deck that I update our team with. And I have one specific slide that just looks at our OER, our NPS, and then that wayfinding score over time for each month. And then we also kind of plot out the actual changes that we've been making, just as a running kind of header along the top. So every time we make an adjustment, I write down the day that it happened. And then we watch and see if it changed where that dot is falling. So that's been a really cool, it's very isolated, tiny little thing, but it's been so valuable for our team to be able to watch that average increase. And even during, our wayfinding score really fluctuates kind of with crowding and things like that. So seeing that it's taking a dip in our really crowded months, but not as much of a dip as it used to do is also encouraging in some ways. So that's one little tiny thing that we do in terms of reporting out our institution specific questions. But I will say on that, it falls on our correlation graph. And I do have to frequently remind our team that when you switch to the full all of COVES, that our dot still shows up, but it doesn't move because it's only us that has that dot. So don't think that we're doing just as well as everybody else. We don't have everybody else. So that's just a weird little thing that I always have to remind people of.
That's a good thing to keep in mind. Anyone else have thoughts about how they're using or sharing some of that institution specific versus some of our shared questions differently or similarly? Okay, I'm going to scroll through and see if there's any questions.
Allison, I'll share an example.
Excellent. Thank you.
So a little bit of a different track, but one of our specific questions is to visitors is asking them if they would identify themselves as an art professional or an art student or an artist. And that, came up unsurprisingly from our content in part, but also from working really closely with our education and learning and engagement teams, and a lot of conversations about sort of gut feelings about serving a lot of artists. That sort of idea of we just know that they come here. And so, then saying, well, that's a question we can ask. We can actually figure that out. And I think internally it has helped us kind of reset a little bit around those expectations, but it's been a particularly useful question to, we've mentioned this throughout, cross with some of these other key experience and demographics pieces. So while it's not particularly helpful maybe to understand that people that identify themselves as artists, either professional or not, give us a high net promoter score consistently, it is really important internally for us to understand that most of them are over the age of 55 and white and well above the average income of other Minnesotans, and especially of the Twin Cities. So I think that that's a question that, again, came out of, like, Marjorie, you say this a lot. I think of this like listen for myths, check for assumptions. So, internally that was, I might not use like capital M myth, but it was certainly something that we kind of held to. And when we were talking about COVES, we were like, well, let's make it a data point, because then it becomes a more well-rounded and more useful conversation. When we talk about programs, when we talk about tours, we can kind of activate it in that way.
Thanks. It's really helpful to think about. There's some questions in the chat about trying to ensure institution-specific questions as similar. I'm curious about what would be helpful for people, or what others might see the benefit of that.
I think it'd be interesting to know about the experience rating statements. Actually, I know you said you didn't include them here because they were maybe just so many variations.
The bulky list.
But it, in our museums, many of us have the "I felt welcomed" at site name today. Many of us have the wayfinding question. By the way, I analyze all my experience ratings by all of the demographic categories. The most boring finding is that wayfinding is higher rated for people who have been here before. So if you figured it out once, you will figure it out again. Not a juicy finding. I don't even, yeah, okay. But yeah, I think those experience statements, I would be interested there, because there's likely more alignment there.
So that actually leads into what will be one of my wrap-up questions, but we can float it now, is now that we've pulled this all together, we have some plans to turn this into some sort of library, perhaps sorting based on topic or similarity, either so you can reference each other's, or when future organizations go, has anyone asked us something, has asked something like, insert question here, we have something that we can point to and say, like, well, here's some ways some other people have asked it. What would be useful? It sounds like also including those ratings questions would be really useful to include on that list, even though they're part of that core, they vary a little bit. What are other things that would be useful or would make this a useful library?
Yeah, I think even just knowing which organizations are asking which questions, if they're comfortable sharing that, like this list is super revealing and I am so grateful for it. But as we're building our institution specific questions, this would have been really helpful to have and know. As Marjorie said, if we do take from each other's lists, it'd be great to be able to be in conversation with each other about it, because I know we used kind of the examples as inspiration, but we didn't know if anybody else was using those questions. So we didn't even know if we could have a conversation about it. So knowing who else is asking that would be great.
And knowing if they felt like they got interesting data from it. Like, did this question fall flat? If so, maybe I shouldn't bother asking it also.
Yeah, or did you get rid of it? I know I was under the impression that Elisa was collecting crowding information, but then learned, no, she's actually just using the actual attendance data and comparing COVES against it. So yeah, even just understanding when there's other ways you can collect it too, that might be useful.
I think that use of data is an interesting opportunity for us to kind of look at other benchmarks. I was intrigued that Alyssa is to the point where they're actually collecting sort of audience segmentation and like personas data. We're heading into similar territory, and it'd be interesting to look at other models for that.
We also did a study with Slover Lynette and also have kind of that psychographic groups. And they're not in this document, but we had a set of custom questions, a little bit different than Nelson Atkins. I didn't just do the 4 summaries that kind of choose their group, but I picked 6 questions that sort of informed, and it's basically like, how do you prefer to use your time at a natural history museum? And it was a forced choice, like I want to be hands-on or I want to sit back. And those all kind of went into their calculus of the different groups. And when we did that study, we identified priority groups for the museum that we wanted to reach out and grow. So my intention was to kind of get that baseline of who on the visitors survey. I started those questions right before COVID, so I never got a ton of data, but I did start processing it, and was challenging because I had to make my own assumptions of who was who based on these questions. So I'm hoping to reactivate those, and I can certainly share them out, but basically it's kind of just to inform this, who just another way of who are we attracting, who are we missing, because we know who our core audience is, and then what type of experience they're having. And I really want to add in some of those other survey questions that we had from Silver Lynette too, and based on some of yours of the welcoming, the inclusive, those are really important. We're starting construction of a whole new welcome center and wing, and a couple years down the line, we're gonna have the Olympics right smack in the middle of us. Hoping that work from home is still possible then. So we also kind of, I'm still trying to figure out, I want to reactivate them next month on our survey and see how useful they actually are. I don't have an answer on that yet, but it's just another way to break down and figure out who's coming, right? Other than just the basic demographics. So just as a side, I'd also love to know where you're all fitting these questions in the course of your survey. So some of the experience, like I felt welcome, those just follow the standard experience ratings of gift stock. Okay, yeah. So yeah, and I'd love to just steal those and be able to compare with you as well. Steal, share, adopt.
We can make sure that those are included. I know from like an administrative background, if it's not specified when people add questions, we add them where they make sense to us. So I encourage you to always use that test function. And if something seems weird or you want it grouped in a different way, we can always adjust that. But barring feedback, we go with what makes sense for us. Any other questions? I'm not sure if I missed any. About 12 minutes left.
I'll just throw out another. I know sometimes some controversial topics are, climate change is controversial, and there's not too many of us, I think, natural history museums here, but decolonization is a huge thing right now, and figuring out how we include Indigenous voices and what we do with our cultural artifacts. So I'm also thinking about how to incorporate that and whether it really belongs on this visitor survey or it really warrants kind of a deeper dive elsewhere. So I'm sure more science centers have the climate change, and we're also thinking that direction too, and wondering if we have it even represented enough. So I'd also be curious, how people are addressing those somewhat controversial items.
I believe Marjorie talked about this a little bit earlier, but it reminded me of something we're doing at MOS where we have some of those big picture questions around things like climate change, because we have them at so many places. We don't just have one exhibit. So we're asking it on COVES, but we're also asking with the same wording as part of the evaluations for those specific experiences, and trying to match up what we're doing. How many of the things that we consider climate change experiences did they hit? So it's not that we're only answering that in COVES, especially for those controversial or really big picture things, but we're using COVES in addition to other data.
And Beth, back to sort of the first half of your question, a lot of those things we do tackle through other methods and using COVES for overall perception of the organization. So we haven't yet asked about, sort of how should we deal with particular aspects of our collections on COVES. We do that in, listening sessions and focus groups and talking circles with Hmong and Ojibwe and Dakota communities around here, where that is where some chunk of our collection sits. But we do have that one question on there that Allison just referenced, which I think is similar to what Boston is doing, is how do you see the museum working towards climate action? And that is in response to the same idea. It's not turning up in one place or one experience, it's turning up in many places. So part of it is really just unpacking. Is this a place where we want expert opinion from the communities who are involved, and we really need that extra detail? Or do we want to see how the community as a whole sees us taking this on and get a sense of their sense of urgency and our position with respect to it? So it's not that we shy away from tough topics, it's that we want to think about what do we want to get on this tough topic and from which audience.
In the last few minutes, any other questions people wanted to ask of each other? Or sharing something you found really useful from, sharing something you found really useful from some of your institution-specific questions? Lauren, can you talk more about how you might use the question around social issues or the from Culture Track?
Yeah, well, we're just developing our survey now, and I saw that, and we are a contemporary art museum, so we talk about the topics of the moment, but I thought this might be too pointed or something similar to ask, but looking at Culture Track, that people are saying that that they think museums should be talking about this. I just don't know if any other museums are sort of, and I think, this was sort of in the same vein what Marjorie was talking about. The focus groups might be a more appropriate approach, but anyone in an art museum context sort of talking about this or content related questions?
Yeah, Lauren, we also participated in that and saw that, helpfully in that Culture Track sample, which we know only went through our email list. So it's already people who have raised their hand or most likely spent money with us in some way. So we know that that samples does look different and sometimes behave differently than our general visitorship. But we also saw that our individual or our audience responses skewed higher along those things of expectations for us to address those elements and incorporate them into our content, you know, and along those questions. And that has been something that we really focused on in that discussion of looking at those results across the institution. And in some ways we've talked about it as like, in this moment of the pandemic, look how our audience is really pressing on us is really telling us how relevant we are. You know, like there are so many reasons why people could say to us right now, art museums are not the meaningful sort of nonprofit organizations to lead right now. And that is not what our audiences are saying back to us. They are saying that they are expecting, you know, in the midst of all of this, all of these other organizations sort of needing to rise to the moment to meet these real crisis needs that are related to the pandemic, that are related to social and racial justice. They kind of expect us to be in the mix there with that. And I guess I would say we haven't really fully grappled with what to do with that, but it was really important. And I kind of keep trying to bring up, like, we heard this, and we heard this from a sample of our audience that we know skews less racially and ethnically diverse, wealthier, et cetera, than our general visitor population. So like, if we're hearing it from them, probably if we asked our general visitors, we would hear it there too, and maybe even louder. So that it's real, like we need to keep talking about this and keep sort of grappling with it for sure. I know that's not a super helpful answer because there's no like action item there, but just kind of sharing that was meaningful for us internally too.
No, that's very helpful. And I think it's good to see the contemporary art museums on here. As we're building our survey, I might be in touch with some of you about that, you know, the idea of relevance and questions around that.
Well, we have just a few minutes left, so I will leave us with a final question or plea. If you have things you would like to see out of this library that you've not brought up yet, please let us know, because the purpose of it would be to be functional to all of you, and we would like to make it as user-friendly as possible. Right, with that, if we have no,
I just want to echo what Beth said. If we could make it a Google Doc, we also could add a column of why did you ask this and how successful was it? And that would be great.
And it might be helpful. It's great to see, you know, which organization's doing what, but organizationally, I'm not going to probably mentally scroll through and like go, what is this person asking? So it'd be more helpful by topic maybe, and then have it tagged with the organization that's asking it. And then as we start duplicating, we can just tag more organizations.
As we have a growing number of art institutions, is it helpful to keep those separate, or just noting that this tends to come from an art museum or this tends to come from a science museum?
I would just note it. I think there's some overlap that we could, like wayfinding and welcoming that came up today. Let's be one big family.
Excellent. All right. Thank you so much for your time. We will share this recording as we have in the past, and I hope you all have a great day. Thank you.
Thanks, Allison.